continue now with our fourth study in the book of Genesis by looking at chapters 6 to 10. These primarily, of course, cover the story of the flood and the story of the descendants of Noah. When we look at the early chapters of Genesis, we recognize that initially, of course, God creates everything good. And then, first of all, there's a breakdown between husband and wife, so that Adam says, "The woman you gave me, God, is the one who caused me to eat." And Eve says, "The serpent that you put in the garden, God, beguiled me and I ate," which shows that humans think God is at fault in what is going on, what's going wrong in the world. Then we see the breakdown also in human family with the story of Adam and Eve's two oldest children, Cain, who kills his brother Abel. And of course, there is some suggestion there that the sacrifice of Abel included shedding of blood and acknowledgement that life had been given in exchange for life versus Cain's offering. But regardless that there is animosity in the family, now we come to the third stage where there is animosity and hatred and wickedness within the whole world. And the fourth stage will be that of the arrogance or hubris of human beings who think that they can make a name for themselves. With Adam and Eve, they're cast out of the garden, but yet they don't die immediately. Cain is forced to wander, but he has a mark put on him so that no one is to kill him. The earth is going to be all destroyed now, but yet there is that one little hope of that man and his family in the ark. And the fourth time, with the story of the Tower of Babel, there will be no way out, except the entire rest of the Old Testament, which says that through Abraham and his family, God would bring a blessing to all the nations. Not because they qualified, not because they were good, but simply because of his own mercy. The story that we have to look at today, the story of the flood, of course, is very, very well known. It's one of the stories that all of us remember being taught when we were in Sunday school. And yet, in terms of the story of salvation, it really has kind of a negative image about it. It's not really telling us anything about how God acts to save, except maybe that little bit that says that the bow is put in the sky and God will never again destroy everyone. It rather shows the seriousness of sin. This business about living a human life the way we want to and doing what we want to and coming up with our own ideas and plans is held up to scorn. Human beings in their old sinful nature cannot come up with any good plan. There's a very weird and strange passage at the beginning and is subject to many, many different interpretations about the sons of God and the daughters of men. There are places in the Bible where sons of God are also references for higher beings. Some would see them as angels later. And the daughters of men being those who are wicked, and the daughters of Cain and Abel, or even from powers of wickedness that were somehow involved in various ancient traditions have been related to that. It very likely is easiest to understand it for us to think of this as when those who do trust and believe in God are brought together with those who do not, and that they try to intermingle and simply make peace with each other, that the side that is against God always wins. We might think about this in light of how do we look at the world around us and try to find out how successful it is in terms of deciding how we are going to be successful in the church. The Lord gives us some very clear indications of what he expects of us. Love other people with my forgiving love. That will be the way in which I touch the hearts of people. That's where the power is. And we need to evaluate all the ways that the world suggests that we can be successful and powerful and strong in light of the fact that the imagination of human hearts always comes up with something that's close to God, but never quite the way God intended it. Well, the result of this breakdown, so that virtually everybody becomes wicked and against God, except for this one man, Noah, and his family, about which no comment is made, is the flood. The flood is sort of like the movie Run Backwards early on. We watched that in the original creation, God ordered everything. He made a roof with waters above. He brought the dry land together with waters underneath. He built everything with the flowers and plants and trees, and then he installed the birds and the fish and the human beings and put human beings in charge over them. I'll never forget the first time I read the story of, or the book of Genesis through in Hebrew, and caught this idea that everything that had been arranged is now disarranged. Everything that had been ordered is now disordered. And all of the order that God had made now becomes chaos, except for that one little boat, except for that one little ark with some of the animals put into it by Noah and his family to be spared and to repopulate the nation after, or repopulate the world afterwards. Sometimes it talks about 2 of every kind, sometimes about 7 of every kind, and we have a rather interesting story to read here about how long it rains and how long the waters are upon the earth, and of course that's been involved much in the story about where the dinosaurs died off, and all sorts of people have tried to do studies on this to try and find out what the remnant of that flood would be. And most of those have kind of come up short in terms of knowing exactly what has taken place. But the indication I think that's most helpful for us, and the part that's most helpful, is to realize that Noah is not really saved by an ark. He is saved by God. God said, I am going to let you know about how you can be delivered from the flood that I am bringing onto this earth, because human beings continually do nothing but evil. They continually act according to their fallen nature. They continually act as people who are trying to keep themselves from dying. And they can't help it. Just as someone who would be falling to their death out of an airplane can't help trying to avoid that last foot, that last bit of a fall. Thus, the best that humans can do is to hold hands on the way down, and that's what we usually call love or society or trying to get along together. And that's often the way in which a lot of people are approached, whether or not they are going to be able to be cared for on the way down. We have a better story. We have a bigger one. We have one about an ark, about a God who comes to save us. Luther even uses this story in the baptismal liturgy, where he says in one of the prayers, as God saved faithful Noah and his family in the flood, drown in us everything that we received from Adam, and save us and bring us safely. A very beautiful German hymn that I learned when I was studying in Germany in the 1970s. A ship that calls itself the Church sails through the seas of life, where God is supporting us. And it's really a very similar notion to the one that I've used about the airplane. It's that which holds us up and protects us when everything around us is threatening. Noah and his wife and his 3 sons, Shem and Ham and Japheth, and their wives are the only ones who are spared. As the waters finally recede and Noah decides to go forth, there is sin that comes and shows its ugly head once again. And all of a sudden we find the story about Noah getting drunk, that he's the first tiller of the soil rather than just one who gathers foods as they, according to this story, would have done beforehand. And as he drinks too much wine, whether he's laying completely naked or his clothes are just up or whatever, Canaan, the son of Ham, laughs about that. And then Shem and Japheth go and they cover their father so that his shame is not seen. The resulting consequence is a curse on Canaan. Of course, the name Canaan is the name for the people who lived in the land of Israel. That was later the land of Israel, and gives some sort of a historical justification for why God finally told the people of Israel to go and destroy the Canaanites who were in the land. It's usually thought that the people of Shem went out to the east, and that's where we get the word the Semites from, or the Semitic languages based on Shem, and that the people of Ham went down into Egypt and Africa, and the people of Japheth went northwest into what we know as Europe, and so they would be the ones that would be connected with us. But as we review the account here, we also ought to recognize that we have a very long list of all the different generations and all the people. And if you were to look at chapter 10 and then look at a later history or map of the historical time periods that get on toward the time of Israel, you'd find that those names that are the names of people become the names of countries. And we find the names of cities in various places as well, so that this identifies people groups that eventually spread out throughout the world. And of course, there is that promise from God that there would be no more flood to wipe everyone out. God's not really acting to save Noah and his family because of a great joy. He sees that Noah is a righteous man, but it is rather using human language that God is so disgusted with everyone else that he finally says, I'll be done with them. This is a tragic time. This is a time that unfolds over hundreds and thousands of years, as it were, where God watches that human beings become worse and worse and worse. We might ask ourselves, are things better now than they used to be? Are they worse than they used to be? The answer is, there is wickedness in every age. And there is mercy in every age only when it comes through God himself and through people. God is merciful to Noah, first of all, to have touched him with his love so that Noah could be righteous. We ought not think that Noah is righteous on his own. He is righteous because God has reached him in the past, has been with him, and that he has not died is a result of him being faithful to the promise of God, to be in the relationship with God. There are those who have counted the fact that even Lamech, his father, would have died in the year of the flood. And as we see this world coming to an end and then being restored once again, we recognize that even those names in the Bible are often names connected with people who had nothing but wickedness in their heart. You might remember Lamech from the last account in chapter 4, where he boasts because he killed a man for just smacking him one. And he was very proud of that. He thought, well, if 7 people should die if anyone kills Cain, then 77 should die if they kill me. Now these other stories go on to show that the wickedness kept on happening. So just because somebody's name is in the Bible doesn't mean that they are necessarily a saint. The Bible is much more a record of all of the sinners. And not only from Noah's family, but his grandson also shows that that wickedness comes up once again. In that table of nations, then, we're getting closer to the time where we have the setting that we know from our own historical time periods, from several thousand years before the time of Christ, but we're moving on, as we will get to it with the time of Abraham, closer to roughly as far before the time of Christ as we are afterwards. And the ages will gradually cut down, and we will see that there will be people living a lot less in terms of the length of time. Some still, like Abraham, will live almost 200 years, but after that it cuts down remarkably quickly. As we look at the story of the flood, we might remember that there is also a sense about worship that's involved with this. When Noah and his family come forth from the ark, they offer a sacrifice to God. They recognize that they could have been put to death just as well, and that the wrath of God against human beings was something that God had spared for them because of his own grace and his mercy. And the response to God's grace is twofold. First of all, it is the offering of thanksgiving, and then it is dealing with others on the basis that God deals with us. Here the emphasis is on the offering that comes to God from Noah and his family, as they are thankful that after this horrible long duration of the flood that God has let them go forth. Historically, we might also point out that people today have thought that they've been able to find remnants of the ark in the mountains in southwestern part of what was once the USSR. The word Ararat in the Bible is connected with Urartu, which is the name of the people who lived north of Syria, the Urarturians, and so it's got some connections later on within the biblical record as well. But it's probably something that is never going to be found, and one would not expect that something like that would have survived for many thousands of years anyway. It gets us into the idea, though, that people think if they can find something like this, then they can hold on a little bit better to their faith. We ought to remember that the promises of God can never be really seen. We can detect the hand of God in the background, but it's not as if we're going to be able to be more sure of ourselves if we can prove that we know who God is and what he has done. The choosing of the animals, animals that were more sets are picked out, and of course the ones that are used for the sacrifice are animals that are more the peaceable or the domestic kind. We never find any animals being sacrificed that were wild animals, and we just have one pair of those that are saved. But the animals that were domestic and that were within the home, that were an important part of the income of people, would be something that would be given then back to God. So as we look at this section, we recognize that the um, wickedness has gotten to its ultimate. And this is more of a negative story rather than a positive one. It explains how come this world is so wicked. Why did God have to act? He spares only Noah at that time, and no one has a good answer about what happens to all of those who die without hearing about God or hearing about Christ. We can spend our time thinking this is the wrong kind of God because he's not merciful, or we can say that it's our time to do what we can to bring to wicked people a love that only God can bring, and to assume that every human being from the get-go is in need of God healing the heart. Whether someone controls their sin and seems to be a nice person or is uncontrolled about it, everyone needs to be touched by that mercy and grace of God. Otherwise, every human being would be lost forever. There is a reference way late in the New Testament about Jesus going and preaching to the spirits in prison, which has some reference to this, and we've looked at that in the discussion of the letters of Peter. But the word that's used there is not a word that offers salvation to them, but proclamation that death will not hold Christ. As we get on in the story from now on, we will see God focus not on everybody, but that he will narrow the focus to one family and say, through that man's family, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. So I pray that God will continue to bless your study and continue to help you in your awareness of the greatness and the majestic way of the mercy and grace of God that's worked for all of us, who has spared us from eternal death and promised to bring us to eternal life. Thank you.